Tonight, you step into a medieval world where women could brew the ale, heal the sick, raise the children, and keep entire households alive, yet still be forbidden from speaking too loudly, travelling alone, owning property freely, or even reading certain books. Beneath the torchlight of castles and the smoke-filled rafters of village halls, every rule shaped their lives in ways that now feel almost unbelievable. So settle in beside the fire, because tonight we're uncovering what medieval women were forbidden to do. And before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these slow medieval journeys through history. Your support truly keeps the candle burning here. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the bells of the medieval world carry you into the night. Hey guys, tonight you find yourself beneath the shadow of a damp stone gatehouse while winter mist crawls slowly over the road like spilled milk across rough oak. Your boots sink into mud thick enough to swallow good intentions, and somewhere above you a watchman coughs into the cold night air while monastery bells drift faintly from beyond the river. Smoke hangs beneath the rafters of nearby houses, carrying the scent of peat, wet wool, horse sweat, and onions boiling in somebody's supper pottage. A dog with one torn ear follows you for reasons known only to dogs and saints. Medieval travel brochures really oversold this experience. The torchlight flickers against slick stone walls, and you quickly begin to understand that people here watch strangers the way cats watch unfamiliar furniture, especially if those strangers happen to be women walking alone after dusk. You probably would not last a week out here without accidentally insulting a baker, stepping in something regrettable, or freezing beside the wrong ditch. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, feel free to comment your location and local time. Somewhere out there, another sleepy traveller is listening beside another imagined fire. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in line before the town gate while a narrow-faced guard holds a lantern close to each traveller's face, as though searching for hidden sins inside their eyebrows. The iron hinges of the gate groan every few moments, opening just wide enough to admit carts loaded with winter cabbages, smoked fish, or bundles of coarse wool wrapped against the rain. Beside you waits a woman carrying 2 baskets balanced across her shoulders with a wooden yoke polished smooth from years of use. Her hands are red from cold water and rough soap, but her eyes remain lowered toward the mud. She says nothing unless spoken to. That, you begin to notice, is expected. A merchant ahead of her argues loudly about tolls, waving his gloves and swearing upon the bones of St. Edmund that he paid already at the southern bridge. Nobody hushes him, nobody stares when he raises his voice. Yet when the basket-carrying woman quietly asks whether the gate will remain open past moonrise, 3 heads turn toward her at once. Not angry exactly, so just surprised, as though a door hinge had spoken. The guard answers without looking directly at her. Women should be inside before dark. Simple words, calm words, yet they settle over the road heavier than snow. The woman nods quickly and lowers her eyes again. You notice she grips the yoke tighter afterward. Inside the walls, the town curls inward around narrow lanes where rushes have been scattered across damp stone floors to soak up mud and spilled ale. Rainwater drips from crooked roofs. A blacksmith's furnace glows like an angry sunset in one corner, while chickens peck beneath a cartwheel nearby. Women pass through these streets constantly carrying things: water buckets, bread baskets, firewood, bundles of flax, babies wrapped in wool blankets. They move with the steady rhythm of people who have worked since before dawn. But rarely do they linger. Rarely do they gather in loud knots beside tavern doors the way men do. And almost never do they walk alone after the final evening bell. You warm your hands beside a brazier outside a baker's stall, where flat loaves cool upon wooden boards dusted with rye flour. The baker himself complains cheerfully about taxes while his daughter works silently beside him, shaping dough with astonishing speed. Her sleeves are rolled to the elbows despite the cold. A silver charm hangs from her neck, shaped like a tiny hand. Some swear such charms ward away fever. Others insist they merely invite demons to notice you more quickly. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. When a passing monk asks the baker a question about grain prices, the daughter begins answering before her father cuts across her words without even glancing her way. "Marjorie," he mutters, less talking. She lowers her head immediately. Not frightened, simply practiced. You begin noticing this rhythm everywhere. Women speaking softly while men speak publicly. Women stepping aside in narrow lanes. Women carrying the work of the town without appearing to fully belong to the life of it. At the centre square, a group of boys chase each other through puddles while a toothless storyteller recounts old Crusader legends beside a fountain crusted with green moss. Nearby, two women pause beside a fish stall to whisper together beneath fur-lined hoods. Their voices stop the instant a bailiff passes near them. No law is spoken aloud. No threat is made. Yet silence arrives all the same. You duck into an alehouse before the rain grows worse. Warm smoke presses low beneath soot-black rafters, and beeswax candles flicker beside wooden trenchers slick with stew grease. A harp player dozes near the hearth while travellers dry their cloaks beside the fire. The one-eared dog follows you inside as though you have signed some invisible companionship contract. A serving woman places a mug of weak ale before you. Her sleeves smell faintly of rosemary and smoke. She moves quickly between tables, avoiding wandering hands with the skill of a battlefield veteran. One old sailor near the hearth mutters that women should never serve ale after sunset because night hours loosen the devil's pockets. Nobody seems entirely sure what that means. The serving woman rolls her eyes so slightly you almost miss it. Across the room, a widow sits alone mending gloves beside candlelight. Even in the dim hall you can tell people treat her differently. She speaks more freely than younger women. She meets men's eyes directly. Widowhood, you learn from overheard whispers, grants certain freedoms marriage does not. Though mostly because society no longer knows quite where to place you once your husband dies. A clerk with ink-stained fingers explained this after his third cup of ale. According to him, unmarried daughters belong beneath fathers, wives beneath husbands, and nuns beneath abbesses and bishops. But widows drift strangely between categories like loose boats untied from docks. Useful, he says, chewing smoked eel thoughtfully, but unsettling. The widow hears him and snorts into her stitching. Outside, rain taps softly against shutters. Somewhere distant, bells mark the evening hour from a monastery hidden beyond the river fog. Time here is measured not by clocks but by bells, candle lengths, and aching backs. The clerk eventually tells you that respectable women should avoid wandering streets alone, joining guild councils, arguing loudly in public squares, carrying weapons, studying certain books, or entering taverns without purpose. The list goes on long enough to outlive the candle beside him. And still the women of the town work endlessly. You saw them hauling water at dawn. You saw them gutting fish in frozen courtyards. You saw them sweeping rushes from stone floors, carrying infants beneath wool cloaks, spinning flax beside doorways, tending gardens blackened by frost. Forbidden does not mean absent. It merely means watched. Near midnight, you climb the creaking stairs to the alehouse loft where travellers sleep shoulder to shoulder beneath rough blankets stuffed with straw. Cold air slips through gaps in the boards. Someone snores like an injured ox. The one-eared dog curls beside your boots with profound confidence. Before sleep takes you, you hear distant laughter from the street below, followed by a woman's voice abruptly silenced. Then only rain, and bells, and the slow breathing of a medieval town settling uneasily into darkness. Morning arrives not with sunlight but with bells. They roll across the town before dawn, deep and heavy through the fog, shaking sleepers from their straw mattresses one monastery hour at a time. Somewhere below the alehouse loft, somebody curses softly while fumbling for boots in the dark. The one-eared dog lifts his head, sighs as though burdened by centuries of human foolishness, then settles again beside your cloak. Cold air creeps through the wooden boards beneath you. The smell of damp wool, old smoke, and stale ale clings stubbornly to everything. A serving girl climbs the stairs carrying a candle stub and a basket of coarse bread, stepping carefully around sleeping travellers without waking them. Her hands are already reddened from work, though dawn has barely arrived. You follow the smell of baking oats downstairs, where the common room slowly fills with labourers warming stiff fingers around steaming bowls of pottage. Outside the shutters, rainwater drips steadily from the eaves. Somewhere nearby, a cartwheel groans in protest against the muddy street. The widow from last night sits near the hearth eating smoked herring with sharp, practical movements. She notices you watching the crowded room and gives a knowing glance toward the doorway, where women already move through the morning carrying baskets and tools. "Market day," she murmurs. And indeed the town begins unfolding itself like a damp wool blanket shaken out after winter storage. Merchants hammer open shutters. Fishmongers spread crushed herbs over tables to soften the smell of river carp. A cooper rolls barrels into place while muttering prayers against cracked wood. Smoke rises from ovens across the square, mixing with the scent of onions, manure, wet leather, and yeast. Women appear everywhere within this motion, yet always within invisible boundaries. Near the fountain, older women sell eggs, herbs, and rough linen from small tables no larger than doors laid flat upon crates. Younger girls carry baskets for fathers or husbands. A brewer's wife unloads ale casks while her husband loudly negotiates prices as though she had merely wandered accidentally into the task. You pause beside a stall where two sisters spin wool using drop spindles while waiting for customers. Their fingers move almost without thought, twisting thread with the steady patience of winter rain. One of them explains quietly that women may sell small household goods in the market if granted permission through family ties: bread, eggs, thread, candles, herbs, sometimes poultry, but not ironwork, not fine cloth trading, not certain guild-protected crafts, not anything men call serious, she adds dryly. Her sister coughs softly at that and glances around before lowering her voice further. Guilds rule much of town life here. Bakers, smiths, masons, weavers, merchants, powerful groups guarded by oaths, fees, and complicated traditions no outsider fully understands. Some guilds allow widows to continue a dead husband's trade temporarily. Others permit daughters to assist fathers quietly from behind counters, but full membership for women remains rare as summer snow. No one can quite agree whether the rules exist from fear, pride, or habit grown too old to question. Probably all three. You continue deeper into the market where noise rises like flocks of birds startled into flight. Vendors shout prices over one another while geese honk indignantly from wicker cages. A travelling tooth puller displays rusty instruments on black velvet beside jars containing things best left undescribed before breakfast. Nearby, a girl no older than 14 arranges ribbons upon a cloth-covered crate. Her mother watches carefully from behind the stall, keeping one eye on customers and another on the bailiff crossing the square. "Smile less," the mother whispers suddenly. The girl blinks in confusion. Men think smiling means promises. The advice lands with the casual heaviness of something repeated across generations. You notice then how many instructions shape women's movements here. Walk carefully, speak softly, lower your gaze, do not linger, do not laugh too loudly, do not attract attention unless attention profits someone else. Even clothing joins the rules. A cloth merchant explains over folded bolts of dyed wool that town authorities sometimes regulate what women may wear depending on class, marriage, or profession. Fur linings reserved for wealthy households, certain silks forbidden entirely, bright crimson dyes considered suspiciously extravagant unless attached to noble blood or large purses. God dislikes vanity, he says solemnly while charging outrageous prices for imported velvet. A truly impressive business strategy. At the edge of the square, you find a narrow lane where unmarried women queue outside the Guildhall carrying woven baskets and folded linens. An elderly steward checks names upon a wax tablet while muttering through missing teeth. These women hope for temporary work cleaning storerooms, sorting wool, mending sacks, or preparing feast halls before an upcoming saint's celebration. None may join guild councils, none may vote within town matters. Most will earn barely enough coin for candles and winter bread. Still they wait patiently in the drizzle. Because patience, too, has become part of survival. One woman near the back of the line quietly jokes that she once tried speaking during a guild meeting after delivering cloth for her father. "What happened?" someone asks. "They stared at me," she says, like a cow reciting scripture. Even now, it's hard to tell whether she finds the memory amusing or exhausting. By midday, the rain eases slightly. Bells echo again from the abbey beyond the river, marking another hour slipping quietly away. You stop beneath an awning where hot chestnuts roast over coals, while a blind fiddler plays near the gutter. The widow from the alehouse reappears beside you carrying onions and coarse salt wrapped in cloth. "You notice it now," she says. "You admit you do." The strange balancing act. Women essential to every corner of town life, yet constantly pressed toward the edges of authority. Allowed to labour but not fully belong. Trusted with homes, children, brewing, harvests, accounts, remedies, spinning, baking, and trade assistance, yet often forbidden from public voice or recognised power. The widow shrugs beneath her heavy cloak. "Men fear disorder more than hardship," she says. "Hardship they understand." Some swear towns once allowed women greater freedoms generations ago before guilds tightened their rules. Others insist things were always this way. Those who tell the stories never fully agree. Toward evening, frost begins forming pale crystals along the edges of barrels and roof tiles. The market slowly folds inward again, as merchants cover goods with canvas and lanterns flicker alive one by one through the mist. A young woman carrying unsold bread passes near the gatehouse. 2 guards stop her immediately with questions about where she's been and why she walks alone after dusk. Nothing cruel in their tone. Almost worse than cruelty. Simple certainty, as though such questioning is as natural as rain or winter wind. You watch her answer carefully, hands clasped tight around the bread basket while torchlight trembles across the wet stones beneath her feet. And as darkness gathers over the town once more, you begin understanding that many medieval prohibitions are not written only in law books or church decrees. Some are written in glances, in habits, in the long shadow cast by other people's expectations. The bells ring again through the cold evening air while smoke curls upward into gathering night, and somewhere ahead waits another road, another firelit hall, another quiet lesson hidden beneath the ordinary rhythm of medieval life. The frost thickens overnight. By dawn the town roofs wear a pale silver crust, and every cartwheel in the street sounds brittle against frozen mud. Smoke rises straight upward into the still morning air before disappearing into low clouds the colour of old wool. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows with such exhausted misery that you suspect even the rooster regrets medieval life. Inside the alehouse, the hearth has burned low. Ash glows softly beneath charred logs while travellers stir awake beneath blankets smelling faintly of smoke and damp sheep. The serving woman from yesterday ladles oat porridge into wooden bowls, moving quietly among the benches while rubbing warmth back into her fingers between tasks. You notice she never sits. Not once. A man may lean beside the fire discussing weather or taxes for an hour without consequence. A woman working indoors seems expected to remain in motion like part of the building itself, carrying, sweeping, stirring, mending, fetching. Always useful, never idle. The widow beckons you toward her corner table, where a tiny beeswax candle burns beside a loaf of coarse bread. Her name, you finally learn, is Agnes. She cuts the bread carefully with a narrow iron knife polished from decades of use. "You travel today?" she asks. You nod. She studies you thoughtfully before gesturing toward the narrow streets beyond the shutter. Then watch the houses more closely than the roads. Outside, the town wakes slowly beneath cold mist. Women sweep rushes from thresholds using bundled reeds, while boys carry buckets from the frozen well. Laundry stiffens on lines like surrender flags abandoned after battle. The one-eared dog trots behind you faithfully, stopping occasionally to inspect puddles with scholarly seriousness. You follow Agnes through winding lanes toward a row of timbered homes pressed shoulder to shoulder beside the inner wall. Here the streets narrow so tightly that neighbours could likely exchange soup recipes through upper windows without leaving bed. Agnes pauses before a sturdy oak door fitted with a heavy iron key. "A married woman's world," she says quietly, "often begins and ends here." Inside, warmth gathers beneath soot-dark rafters, where onions and herbs hang drying beside strings of garlic. A stew pot bubbles gently over the hearth, while geese feathers drift across the rush-covered floor. Two children chase each other around a spinning wheel until their mother hushes them with practiced exhaustion. The house belongs to a wool merchant currently away inspecting sheep beyond the river. His wife, Edith, welcomes Agnes warmly and sets out ale in thick pottery cups. You quickly notice that Edith runs every visible corner of this household. She directs servants, measures flour stores, records debts with charcoal marks on wax tablets, supervises spinning, manages salted meat barrels, and keeps track of winter candles. Yet when conversation drifts toward property or contracts, her voice changes slightly. Careful now. Measured. Because despite managing nearly everything within these walls, the law rarely treats the household as truly hers. Marriage here binds more than affection or duty. It folds a woman's legal standing into a husband's like thread woven permanently into cloth. Dowries pass between families. Land agreements shift. In some places, wives cannot independently sign contracts, own certain property, or pursue trade without permission. Some swear these customs protect women from ruin. Others quietly observe that the protection often resembles a locked chest whose key belongs to somebody else. Edith opens a wooden coffer near the bed and shows Agnes folded linens prepared years earlier for her marriage portion. Embroidered cloths, pewter spoons, wool blankets, tiny silver pins, objects carried from her father's home into her husband's. A woman arrives with goods, Edith says softly, but rarely with freedom. Then she smiles apologetically as though worried such honesty itself might offend the walls. The children settle near the hearth, chewing crusts of bread while Agnes helps spin wool beside the fire. The rhythm of the spindle becomes strangely hypnotic twist, pull, wind, repeat, while outside faint bells drift across the frosted town. Edith explains that respectable wives are expected to obey husbands, maintain households, bear children, supervise servants if fortunate enough to have them, and protect family reputation above nearly everything else. Reputation matters here with terrifying force. Too much laughter at market. Too much ale. Too many conversations with strangers. Too much independence. Any of it may feed gossip faster than rats finding grain. You notice this especially when a neighbour woman enters carrying cabbage leaves wrapped in cloth. She lowers her voice immediately upon mentioning another villager rumoured to argue publicly with her husband. People talk, she murmurs darkly, as though people were a plague moving invisibly through walls. No one can quite agree whether medieval gossip travels by feet, wind, or witchcraft, but it certainly arrives everywhere ahead of schedule. Near midday, Edith takes you to the merchant quarter where wealthier homes rise taller above the muddy lanes. Coloured shutters, iron lantern hooks, carved door frames showing saints or lions. Yet even here, among prosperous households, married women move carefully within expectations. One nobleman's wife passes in a fur-lined cloak surrounded by servants carrying baskets and prayer books. Her gown is richly dyed blue, expensive enough to purchase several cows, but she still lowers her eyes when greeting older male officials near the square. Silk cannot entirely loosen custom. At a nearby courtyard, you overhear two clerks discussing inheritance laws while tallying accounts on parchment. Sons first, brothers second, uncles if necessary. Daughters somewhere further down the ladder unless special arrangements intervene. A widow may temporarily manage holdings, but permanent authority remains complicated, fragile, conditional. Like balancing candles during a storm, Agnes later tells you of women who secretly learned household accounting better than their husbands, yet still required male relatives to formally conduct business. Others became expert brewers or cloth managers while remaining legally invisible beside the men representing their labour publicly. You learn to live sideways, Agnes says. The phrase lingers with you. Toward evening you help Edith carry firewood into the courtyard while snow begins falling in slow, uncertain flakes. The children gather rushes for the hearth. A servant girl rubs goose fat onto cracked hands to keep skin from splitting in the cold. Edith glances toward the street where two young unmarried women hurry past before curfew bells. They still have choices, she says quietly, but even she sounds uncertain. Marriage offers protection, stability, shared labour, social respectability. Yet it also narrows the walls around daily life until duty fills nearly every corner. As darkness settles over the town, candles glow behind shutters one by one like distant stars caught in timber frames. Somewhere beyond the walls a dog barks into the snow-covered fields. The one-eared companion beside you lifts his head briefly before returning to sleep near the hearth. Inside the warm house, Edith locks the oak door with its heavy iron key, not dramatically, not fearfully, simply as part of the ordinary rhythm of medieval evening. And you realize that for many women here, forbidden things are not always distant dreams of rebellion or scandal. Sometimes they are smaller, quieter, the ability to decide where one belongs, the freedom to move without explanation, or the simple right to hold the key to one's own door. Snow lingers only briefly. By morning, the white crust has already surrendered to brown slush beneath cartwheels and boots, leaving the streets wetter than before. Meltwater drips steadily from rooftops into gutters lined with straw, fish scales, and things best not examined too carefully before breakfast. A grey sky hangs low above the town walls while distant bells mark the first working hour after dawn. You leave Edith's warm household reluctantly, carrying the memory of the hearth smoke still caught in your cloak. The one-eared dog trots beside you with patient determination, pausing occasionally to shake mud from his paws in dramatic bursts of outrage. Ahead, people gather near the manor court. Not because anyone enjoys court days, quite the opposite. The crowd moves with the heavy curiosity of villagers drawn toward trouble they privately hope belongs to somebody else. The court occupies a long timber hall beside the bailiff's storehouse, its roof blackened by decades of smoke and weather. Wet cloaks steam gently inside as peasants, merchants, servants, and reeves crowd shoulder to shoulder upon rush-covered floors. Beeswax candles flicker along narrow tables where clerks sharpen quills and prepare parchment rolls tied with faded ribbons. The air smells of wet wool, damp boots, old ink, and nervousness. A monk near the entrance quietly sells small saint medallions for truthful speech and favourable judgment. Business appears excellent. You settle near the rear wall while villagers file forward one by one to settle disputes over pigs, fences, unpaid rents, damaged carts, wandering sheep, and insults delivered during alehouse arguments. Medieval justice, you discover, spends a surprising amount of time discussing livestock and hurt feelings. Yet beneath the ordinary complaints runs another current entirely. Reputation, especially women's reputation. A farmer accuses his neighbour's daughter of improper wandering after sunset with a cooper's apprentice. Nobody seems especially concerned whether anything truly happened between them. The accusation itself already carries weight. The girl stands before the steward, clutching her sleeves tightly. "I walked home from my aunt's house," she says. The steward barely looks up from his parchment. "Were you alone?" "Yes." A murmur passes through the hall. Alone. Such a small word, yet it lands with the force of confession. The cooper's apprentice denies wrongdoing so casually you suspect he barely considers himself part of the scandal at all. He shrugs, laughs once, receives a warning to avoid idle behaviour. The girl receives a lecture about modesty, caution, and avoiding temptation. You begin noticing how differently suspicion settles upon men and women here. Men may stumble drunkenly from taverns, argue publicly, swear loudly, even occasionally brawl without permanently damaging social standing. Women, meanwhile, walk across thinner ice. A whisper may follow them for years. Near the front bench sits an older woman wrapped in a patched green cloak. Villagers glance toward her carefully without meeting her eyes directly. Agnes, seated beside you, leans closer. "She knows herbs," Agnes murmurs. Apparently this alone places the woman halfway between respected healer and possible servant of dark forces, depending entirely upon whether your fever improves afterward. Some swear she cured a child's winter cough using thyme and goose fat. Others insist her cat understands human speech. Those who tell the stories never fully agree. The court clerk eventually summons her forward over a complaint involving charms tied beside a cowshed. "Protection knots," the woman explains calmly, "against sickness." The steward frowns. Who permitted such practices? She hesitates just long enough for the silence itself to become dangerous. You notice then how medieval courts judge more than actions. They judge obedience, tone, humility, position within society's invisible ladder. Especially for women, the old healer finally receives a warning to avoid suspicious displays. The matter ends there mostly because half the village secretly relies upon her remedies during winter illnesses. Fear and dependence often sleep in the same bed. At midday the hall grows warmer and louder. Steam rises from soaked cloaks hanging near the hearth, while clerks rub cramped fingers over ink-stained hands. A boy distributes trenchers of coarse bread spread with onion paste to officials seated near the front. A married woman named Cecily now appears before the court accused of speaking abusively toward her husband in public. The charge itself sounds almost absurd at first, yet the room stills noticeably. Her husband describes the argument in great detail, emphasizing her sharp tongue beside the fish market after he returned drunk from an alehouse. Conveniently, his drunkenness interests the court far less than her shouting. Cecily stands rigid as oak. "He spent our candle money on ale," she says flatly. Several villagers cough into their sleeves, suspiciously close to laughter. The steward warns her about obedience and proper conduct. He speaks gently enough, but the message beneath the words remains firm. A disorderly household threatens social order itself. A loud wife unsettles the expected shape of things. You overhear someone mention ducking stools afterward, an unpleasant punishment occasionally used for women accused of scolding, gossiping excessively, or disturbing public peace. No one describes it with enthusiasm, though some men discuss it with grim amusement the way people joke about terrible weather they secretly fear. Even now, it is hard to tell whether such punishments exist more to control behavior or simply to remind everyone watching where authority rests. Outside the hall, snowmelt drips steadily from the roof while merchants continue trading in the muddy square as though human dignity were merely another item bought and sold between bells. You step into the courtyard for air. A young scribe follows carrying parchment rolls beneath his arm. Ink stains cover his fingertips like permanent bruises. He explains that women rarely serve officially as court officers, legal clerks, or sworn witnesses in important disputes unless circumstances force necessity. Women remember things too emotionally, he says with scholarly confidence. This from a man currently panicking because a goose stole his lunch moments earlier. The goose, notably, displays excellent legal instincts. By late afternoon the hall empties slowly. Villagers leave muttering about fines, judgments, marriages, rumours, and debts while dusk gathers beyond the shutters. Agnes remains seated beside the dying fire for a long while before finally speaking. "Most people obey long before punishment arrives," she says quietly. You think about the girl questioned for walking alone, the healer warned over protective knots, Cecily standing humiliated before strangers because she shouted at a drunken husband. No chains, no dungeon, mostly pressure, expectation, endless correction. The bells ring again outside, low and distant through gathering fog. As you leave the court behind, the town feels subtly altered, narrower somehow, as though invisible walls stand beside the visible ones. Women pass through the streets carrying bread, firewood, children, water pails, bundles of wool. Their labour fills every corner of medieval life. Yet around them hangs a constant caution. Speak carefully. Walk carefully. Exist carefully. The one-eared dog nudges your hand impatiently as snowmelt drips from the rooftops into the darkening street. Ahead, candles begin glowing behind shuttered windows while somewhere beyond the river, an abbey bell calls monks toward evening prayer. And through the cold mist of approaching night, you continue onward beneath the slow, watchful rhythm of the medieval world. Night settles heavily after the manor court, thick with fog drifting from the river banks and smoke pressed low beneath the winter sky. The town gates close behind you with a long groaning scrape of iron that echoes through the streets like the shutting of some enormous wooden chest. Inside the walls, Lanterns glow faintly through shutters, while footsteps soften upon damp earth and scattered rushes. Agnes leads you toward the Abbey guest house beyond the northern quarter, where travellers sometimes find shelter beside the monastery orchards. The one-eared dog follows faithfully, though he pauses outside a butcher's stall long enough to consider abandoning you forever for a sausage link hanging temptingly in the cold air. Loyalty, like sainthood, clearly has limits. The road climbs slightly toward the Abbey Hill. Frost whitens the grass between cart tracks while bare trees creak quietly in the wind. Ahead rises the monastery itself, stone walls pale beneath moonlight, narrow windows glowing amber behind horn panes, bells hanging silent above steep roofs slick with rain. You smell beeswax before reaching the gate, then parchment, then damp stone. A lay brother admits you through a narrow oak door reinforced with iron bands worn smooth by generations of hands. He carries a lantern that throws soft trembling light across cloister walls lined with moss and ancient cracks. Somewhere deeper within the abbey, voices chant evening prayers in low, steady tones that seem to vibrate through the floor itself. The sound is strangely comforting, like winter wind passing through pine trees. The guest-house chamber contains little beyond straw pallets, wool blankets, and a small hearth where embers glow beneath ash. Yet after the muddy town streets, the stillness feels almost luxurious. A novice brings bread, onion broth, and watered ale before hurrying away with eyes lowered. You notice nearly everyone here lowers their eyes. Monasteries shape people differently than markets or manor courts. Silence matters, obedience matters, routine matters most of all. Time unfolds according to bells. Wake, pray, work, eat, pray again, sleep, repeat until death or sainthood, whichever arrives first. Near the hearth sits an elderly scribe warming ink-stained fingers over the coals. His robe sleeves smell faintly of vellum and candle smoke. Agnes greets him warmly, and after some quiet conversation he agrees to show you the scriptorium before Compline bells. The corridors twist through cold stone passages lit by tiny oil lamps. Wax drips harden along the walls like pale roots. Somewhere water echoes steadily through hidden pipes beneath the abbey floors. Then you enter the scriptorium. The room glows gold beneath dozens of candles. Long wooden desks stretch beneath narrow windows while monks bend silently over parchment pages covered in impossibly neat lines of ink. Goosefeather quills scratch softly in the stillness. Shelves overflow with chained books bound in leather darkened by age and fingertips. Illuminated letters bloom across certain pages in red, blue, and gold leaf like tiny jeweled gardens hidden inside scripture. The smell here feels almost sacred. Dust, ink, beeswax, old leather. Knowledge itself seems to linger in the air. And immediately you understand something important. Books are rare enough to feel dangerous. A single volume may require months or years to copy by hand. Some monasteries guard manuscripts more carefully than silver relics. Learning belongs largely to churches, clerks, and educated men trained for years beneath strict discipline. Most women never gain access to such spaces at all. The elderly scribe explains this while trimming a candlewick carefully with iron scissors. Some noble daughters learn letters, he says. Some nuns copy prayers. A few abbesses grow quite scholarly. Then he shrugs. But most women have households to tend. Simple words again. Always simple words. Yet the effect spreads outward endlessly. If education remains restricted, so too does power. Contracts, laws, scripture, property records, royal decrees all flow through written language most women cannot easily access. Even many men cannot read, of course. Peasants especially often rely upon memory, spoken agreements, and church instruction rather than books. Yet women face additional barriers layered atop ordinary medieval hardship. The scribe unlocks a chained manuscript for you using a tiny iron key hanging from his belt. "Books wander," he says dryly, "especially the expensive ones." Inside the manuscript, saints gaze solemnly from painted pages while Latin prayers curl in elegant black lines. Nearby, a young novice carefully scrapes away an ink mistake with a small knife. One error, hours ruined. "You ask whether women ever work here?" The old scribe nods slowly. "In nunneries, yes. Some are excellent copyists." He pauses. "Better than certain monks I could name." A dangerous sparkle briefly appears in his tired eyes. Still, such opportunities remain limited mostly to noble women entering convents or rare daughters of wealthy families. Even then, education often centers upon prayer, devotion, music, embroidery, and household management rather than broader scholarship. A woman knowledgeable beyond accepted limits may invite suspicion nearly as easily as admiration. No one can quite agree where wisdom ends and impropriety begins. You continue through the library where books rest chained to reading desks beneath heavy wooden beams. Agnes runs her fingertips gently across one cracked leather spine. "My cousin entered a convent once," she says quietly. The old scribe nods. For some women, convent life offers freedoms marriage does not. And indeed, within certain abbeys women may manage estates, study texts, supervise schools, preserve medical knowledge, and lead religious communities. Some abbesses command significant respect. Yet even these freedoms remain bounded carefully by church hierarchy. Bishops oversee convents. Male clergy retain ultimate authority. Women may serve God devotedly, but rarely lead beyond prescribed walls. Outside, bells begin ringing for night prayers. The sound rolls through cloisters and corridors until even the candles seem to listen. You join the slow procession entering the abbey chapel where cold stone arches vanish upward into shadow. Monks kneel beneath flickering candlelight, while incense curls softly through the dark like pale river mist. Latin chants rise and fall in hypnotic waves. At the rear of the chapel, separated quietly from the main choir, kneel several women from nearby households. They pray here, but apart. The division appears ordinary enough that nobody remarks upon it. And perhaps that is what strikes you most throughout this journey. Restrictions rarely arrive dramatically. They settle gradually into architecture, ritual, habit, conversation, into where people stand, where they speak, where they are permitted to learn. After prayers, the guest house grows still. Wind rattles faintly against shutters while embers collapse softly in the hearth. Agnes sleeps already beneath rough blankets, one hand curled beneath her cheek. The elderly scribe remains awake a little longer beside the dying fire. "Knowledge changes people," he murmurs almost to himself. Then after a pause, "That is why some fear it." The candle beside him gutters low, throwing long shadows across the stone floor. Outside, bells fade into the winter darkness while snow threatens again somewhere beyond the abbey walls. And in the quiet heart of the monastery, surrounded by books most women will never touch, you begin to understand how power may hide not only in swords or laws, but in who is allowed to read the words that shape the world. Before dawn, the abbey wakes in darkness. Bells roll through the stone corridors long before sunrise, deep enough to rattle the shutters and stir cold air beneath the blankets. Somewhere nearby, sandals scrape across worn flagstones while sleepy monks move toward prayer with the resigned determination of men who have repeated the same routine since childhood. You rise reluctantly from the straw pallet. The hearth has nearly died, leaving only faint red embers beneath grey ash. Frost feathers the inside edges of the horn window, and your breath clouds softly in the air. The one-eared dog refuses to move at first. A wise decision, honestly. Eventually even he surrenders to the morning, stretching beside the hearth while Agnes wraps herself in a wool cloak lined with rabbit fur gone thin at the cuffs. Together you follow the faint candlelight toward the chapel once more. Outside, the abbey courtyard glimmers pale beneath moonlit frost. Bare branches creak overhead while wind carries the scent of pine smoke from distant cottages below the hill. The world feels suspended between sleeping and waking. Inside the chapel, beeswax candles flicker against carved saints whose stone faces seem permanently exhausted by human behaviour. Incense hangs low beneath the arches, sweet and smoky at once. Monks chant from illuminated books resting upon lecterns while shadows sway gently across the floor. Again, you notice the women gathered separately. Not hidden exactly, just placed. A few noblewomen kneel near the rear beneath fur-lined cloaks embroidered with tiny silver crosses. Beside them sit widows, merchant wives, servant girls, and elderly villagers clutching prayer beads worn smooth by anxious fingers. None approach the altar itself. None enter the choir space where the monks sing. The boundary remains invisible yet absolute. After prayers, Agnes guides you toward the side cloister where morning light slowly begins leaking grey across the abbey stones. A young nun passes carrying bundles of candles for the chapel. Her hands smell faintly of lavender oil and hot wax. She nods politely but keeps moving. Women within convent life, you learn, exist in a strange balance between reverence and restriction. Nuns may read, copy texts, teach children, preserve herbal remedies, even manage substantial lands in wealthy abbeys. Yet beyond certain limits, sacred authority remains firmly closed. Women may not become priests, may not hear confessions officially, may not deliver sermons before congregations, may not perform mass. The Church venerates holy women endlessly in stories and relics, while carefully controlling the spaces where living women may lead. A monk sweeping frost from the cloister steps explains this with complete certainty. Eve invited disorder first, he says matter-of-factly, so the Church guards proper order carefully. He says it the same way one might explain winter rain or muddy roads. Not cruelly, simply as fact. Agnes says nothing beside you, though her expression tightens slightly beneath her hood. The morning meal is served in near silence inside the refectory. Thick oat porridge, brown bread hard enough to discourage theft, weak ale safer than much of the water. Monks eat while one brother reads scripture aloud from a raised lectern, his voice echoing softly through the hall. Even meals become lessons here. You notice the women guests seated separately again along the side wall. Small divisions repeated endlessly until they become part of the landscape itself. After breakfast, the elderly scribe from last night offers to show you the abbey treasury before travellers depart. The chamber lies beneath heavy stone vaults secured by iron locks thick as your wrist. Inside rest reliquaries shaped from silver and gold, jewelled crosses, embroidered vestments, candle-stands taller than children, and glass vials supposedly containing saintly blood, tears, or fragments of sacred bone. Some swear one tiny finger bone here once healed a blind shepherd instantly. Others insist it belonged to an ordinary goat. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. Pilgrims travel enormous distances to kneel before such relics. Women especially often come seeking fertility blessings, safe childbirth, relief from fevers, or protection for absent husbands. The Church grants spiritual comfort generously. Authority less so. A noblewoman enters while you stand near the reliquary cabinet. Her gown trails across the stone floor like dark river water, and servants follow carrying prayer candles wrapped carefully in linen. She donates silver coins to the abbey, requests prayers for her ill child, and receives solemn blessings from the attending priest. Yet when she asks a question regarding a passage of scripture painted beside the chapel arch, the priest answers briefly before turning toward a male pilgrim beside her. The shift happens almost invisibly, but you see it. Outside in the cloister garden, winter herbs push stubbornly through frost-dark soil. Rosemary, sage, rue, plants prized for medicine, prayer rituals, and warding illness. A nun tending the beds explains their uses quietly, while trimming dead stems with iron shears. Women often preserve enormous practical knowledge here: childbirth remedies, healing salves, household management, herb lore, care for the sick. Entire communities depend upon such skills. Yet formal recognition flows elsewhere. The nun smiles faintly when describing this contradiction. People trust women's hands, she says, more than women's authority. The phrase lingers long after she returns to her work. By midday, pilgrims begin arriving through the abbey gate despite the cold. Muddy boots, wooden staffs decorated with pilgrim badges, cloaks stiff from rain and travel. Among them walks a young woman journeying toward a distant shrine with her older brother acting as escort. Agnes quietly explains that women travelling alone on pilgrimage often attract suspicion or danger. Escort provides protection, respectability, and proof of honourable intent. Without such safeguards, a lone woman wandering roads may quickly become the subject of rumour. Or worse. The young pilgrim herself seems weary already. Windburn reddens her cheeks, and she grips her prayer beads tightly while monks direct travellers toward shelter. Saints protect honest roads, one monk tells her kindly. The one-eared dog sneezes at this with impeccable timing. Toward afternoon the abbey bells ring again across the valley while clouds gather heavy with new snow. Smoke curls upward from town chimneys below the hill. Somewhere distant, an axe strikes wood in slow measured rhythm. You stand beneath the chapel arch watching women move quietly through the abbey grounds carrying water, lighting candles, tending herbs, delivering bread, kneeling in prayer, caring for the sick. Present everywhere, leading nowhere beyond permitted boundaries. And still, despite every restriction, traces of resistance remain hidden within ordinary life. A nun preserving forbidden texts, a widow managing property cleverly enough to outwit relatives, a healer passing knowledge secretly between generations, a girl learning letters beside candlelight after everyone sleeps. Small acts, quiet acts, like embers surviving beneath ash. As evening approaches, snow finally begins falling again across the cloisters, softening the stone world into silence while bells echo through the fading light. And beneath the ancient arches of the abbey, where women may worship but not fully command, you continue learning how power often hides behind the language of holiness itself. Snow falls steadily through the night, softening the world beyond the abbey walls until even the roads seem uncertain where they lead. By morning, the cloister garden lies buried beneath a pale blanket broken only by herb stalks, poking through like the fingers of old buried saints. Bells ring dimly through the snowfall while smoke drifts upward from chimneys below the hill. Inside the guest house, travellers prepare reluctantly for departure. Cloaks stiff with frost hang near the hearth while boots dry beside steaming socks that smell heroic in all the wrong ways. The one-eared dog sleeps directly in the warmest spot near the fire with the confidence of a creature who pays no taxes and fears no authority. a life many secretly envy. Agnes tells you the road south remains passable despite the weather. A nearby weaving village holds market gatherings even in winter, and she wishes to visit a cousin there before the next storm closes the forest paths entirely. So after morning bread and weak ale, you descend the snowy road together. The world beyond the abbey feels quieter now. Snow muffles cartwheels and footsteps alike. Bare trees lean over the road like tired monks listening to confession. Somewhere in the distance, woodcutters strike frozen trunks with slow, echoing blows. Women pass along the roadside carrying bundles of flax wrapped carefully against the damp. Others balance baskets of spun wool atop their heads beneath fur-lined hoods. Work continues regardless of weather, especially women's work. By midday you reach the weaving village, a narrow cluster of timber houses gathered beside a half-frozen stream whose water powers several creaking fulling mills. Wooden frames holding stretched cloth stand frozen stiff in nearby yards, while smoke curls lazily from low chimneys. The entire village smells of wet wool. Not unpleasant exactly. Just persistent. Inside Agnes's cousin's cottage, warmth presses outward from a stone hearth where cabbage soup simmers in a soot-darkened pot. Several women sit spinning thread beside the fire, while children nap beneath rough blankets stuffed with straw and feathers. The room hums softly with labour. Spindles turning, loom weights clicking, thread winding through careful fingers. Women here produce enormous amounts of clothwork, spinning flax into linen, carding wool, weaving narrow bands, sewing garments, embroidering church cloths, repairing cloaks, dyeing thread with onion skins or crushed plants. Medieval textile production rests heavily upon female labour. Yet recognition rarely follows. Agnes's cousin, Joan, explains this while feeding sticks into the fire. Women may spin, she says, men own the looms. Not always literally, perhaps, but often enough. In many towns, powerful weaving guilds restrict women from mastering certain trades independently. Women assist fathers or husbands. Widows sometimes inherit workshops temporarily. Girls apprentice informally within families, but official guild membership, voting rights, and profitable contracts usually remain guarded by men. Even though much of the actual labour passes through women's hands, you spend the afternoon inside a weaving shed attached to the cottage, where two upright looms dominate the narrow room like wooden skeletons. Wool threads stretch tight across beams while a teenage girl works the pedals with practiced rhythm. Back and forth. Lift. Pull. Beat the weft tight. Repeat. The process feels endless. Her fingers move quickly despite the cold, though she admits she cannot officially train as a master weaver. Her brothers may eventually join the guild in town. She likely will not. "Unless I marry one," she says dryly. Snow taps softly against the shutters while she works. Nearby hangs a collection of protective charms woven into tiny knots of red thread. Some swear these prevent tangled wool or broken loom strings. Others insist they merely comfort anxious workers through long winter days. No one can quite agree whether medieval superstition exists because life feels uncertain, or because uncertainty itself becomes easier to bear with rituals attached. Probably both. Later you accompany Joan into the village dye shed where cloth hangs drying from rafters above steaming vats. The air smells sharply of vinegar, urine, smoke, and wet sheep. Medieval dyeing, you discover, possesses very little concern for modern comfort. A boy stirring one vat complains that his eyebrows disappeared briefly last spring after leaning too close to heated mordants. You decide not to investigate further. Joan explains that women often handle spinning and preliminary cloth preparation, yet certain stages of textile trade, large-scale dye contracts, merchant distribution, guild negotiations remain restricted territory. Men say markets are rough places, she mutters while wringing water from dyed thread, as though spinning beside boiling chemicals is a peaceful hobby. Outside, snow continues falling across the village lanes. Women move between cottages, carrying wool baskets beneath cloaks dusted white. An elderly spinner sits beneath a porch roof reciting prayers softly, while working thread through swollen fingers bent crooked by years of labour. Her spindle never stops moving. At dusk, the village gathers inside a long communal hall where candles flicker beside hanging bundles of drying herbs. Supper consists of barley pottage thickened with onions and scraps of smoked eel. Steam fogs the low rafters while children chase each other between benches until scolded into silence. A travelling merchant shares news from distant towns where certain guilds recently fined women accused of selling cloth without proper authorization. Another village reportedly punished widows weaving independently after dark to avoid taxes. Night weaving, he calls it ominously, which sounds considerably more exciting than the reality probably deserves. Still, beneath the jokes lies something colder. Economic control. Who may sell openly? Who may earn independently? Who remains dependent upon fathers, husbands, brothers, or guild permissions simply to survive? You notice the teenage weaver from earlier sitting quietly near the hearth mending sleeves by candlelight. She listens closely whenever merchants discuss distant towns or trade routes, perhaps imagining wider possibilities, perhaps simply tired. Even now it is hard to tell. As evening deepens, older women begin telling stories beside the fire, tales of clever wives secretly managing bankrupt workshops, of widows disguising daughters as sons to continue family trades, of female brewers ruined after guild restrictions tightened in nearby cities. Some stories sound true. Others feel shaped by years of retelling beside winter hearths. Those who tell the tales never fully agree. Outside, snow muffles the village completely now. Only the stream beneath the mill still moves audibly through the darkness, slow and hidden beneath ice. Before sleep, Joan places iron shears beneath her bed. For nightmares, she explains casually. Apparently sharp iron frightens wandering spirits. It also, one suspects, discourages thieves and overly curious chickens. You lie awake listening to the quiet creak of looms settling in nearby workshops while wind brushes softly against the shutters. Around you, this village survives through endless female labour spinning, sewing, washing, weaving, mending, dyeing. Yet official power rests elsewhere, and as the snow-covered night closes gently around the weaving village, you begin understanding that medieval restrictions often operate through something subtler than outright prohibition, not always forbidding women to work, simply ensuring the rewards, recognition, and authority belong mostly to someone else. The snow stops sometime before dawn. When you step outside Joan's cottage, the world feels hushed and strangely bright beneath a pale winter sky. Frost clings to fences, tree branches, and wagon wheels abandoned beside the weaving sheds. Smoke rises lazily from chimneys into cold blue air, while the frozen stream beside the mill groans softly beneath thin ice. Women are already awake. Of course they are. One carries water buckets balanced across a shoulder yoke, while another shakes snow from drying cloth lines with quick, practiced movements. A girl no older than 12 scatters feed for chickens while rubbing warmth into her bare hands between handfuls of grain. The one-eared dog bounds through the snow with scandalous joy, entirely unaware of medieval hardship. Agnes wraps her cloak tighter and tells you the pilgrim road lies only a few miles south. Traders, monks, messengers, and holy travellers pass there constantly when weather allows. She intends to follow it toward the next market town before turning east to visit relatives near the river valley. So after warm bread spread with onion fat and a final farewell to Joan's household, you continue onward beneath the brittle winter sun. The road curves through dark pine woods where frost crackles beneath your boots. Ravens call overhead from bare branches while old wagon ruts lie frozen hard as stone. Here and there roadside shrines appear beside the path, weathered wooden saints blackened by rain. Tiny candle niches filled with hardened wax, scraps of ribbon tied to branches by passing travellers seeking blessings or luck. Some swear certain shrines protect women in childbirth if touched with the left hand before dawn. Others insist they merely shelter mice and disappointed spiders. Those who tell the stories never fully agree. By midday you reach the pilgrim road itself. Even in winter it remains busy. Merchants guide mule carts piled with salt barrels and wool bales. Monks travel in pairs beneath heavy cloaks. Peasants trudge between villages carrying tools, baskets, or sacks of grain. Pilgrims with badges pinned to their cloaks limp toward distant shrines through mud and melting snow. Movement never entirely stops in the medieval world, but freedom of movement does not belong equally to everyone. You begin noticing it almost immediately. A lone young man passes without attracting so much as a glance. Moments later, a woman walking alone with a bundle of herbs tied across her back receives long, suspicious looks from nearly every traveller she passes. Not hostility exactly. Worse, perhaps. Assumption. A carter mutters something about unsafe roads for decent women while crossing himself quickly as she disappears ahead into the trees. Agnes watches quietly. People distrust women who travel freely, she says after a moment, especially if no man explains why. The road soon brings you to a small toll bridge crossing a narrow river half choked with ice. Two guards wrapped in fur cloaks question travellers beneath a sagging timber shelter while collecting coins into a locked iron box. Men answer briefly and continue onward. Women receive additional questions. Where are you headed? Who accompanies you? Why travel now? Are you married? One merchant's daughter, travelling with her father, barely speaks at all while he answers for her entirely. Another woman carrying pilgrim badges explains repeatedly that she journeys toward a saint's shrine after surviving illness last autumn. The guards eventually allow her passage but exchange doubtful glances afterward. You cross the bridge beneath creaking ropes and fluttering scraps of prayer cloth tied by previous travellers. River mist curls upward through the wooden planks, while somewhere downstream bells echo faintly from a hidden chapel. Ahead, the road widens near a roadside inn crowded with wagons. Smoke pours from the chimney thick as storm clouds. Inside, warmth and noise crash over you all at once, clattering cups, crackling firewood, muddy boots stomping melted snow across rush-covered floors. Travellers cluster around long tables sharing ale, gossip, and exaggerated stories about bandits who apparently multiply with every retelling. A serving woman moves swiftly through the room, balancing trenchers of smoked fish and black bread. Unlike the quiet market women back in town, she carries herself with hard confidence sharpened by constant exposure to strangers. Still, you notice she never lingers too long beside any table. Too much friendliness risks rumour. Too little risks poor coin. Medieval hospitality resembles walking across frozen ponds while pretending not to hear the ice crack. Near the hearth sits a young woman dressed as a pilgrim. Mud cakes the hem of her cloak and exhaustion shadows her face. She travels with two older women toward a distant abbey renowned for healing miracles. Never alone, one of the older women says firmly when conversation turns toward the road. She explains that women travelling without companions risk theft, harassment, accusations of impropriety, or simple disappearance into forests and roadside ditches, no authority troubles itself to investigate too closely. Some towns even require written permission for women to travel independently under certain circumstances, especially servants or unmarried daughters. A folded letter may determine whether gates open easily or suspicion follows every mile. You ask whether the danger comes more from criminals or reputation. The older pilgrim gives a tired smile. Usually both. Outside the inn, daylight fades quickly beneath gathering clouds. Wagon drivers rush to secure horses before another snowfall arrives. A blacksmith repairs a broken wheel rim beside the stable, while muttering inventive curses involving saints, pigs, and wheel spokes. The one-eared dog steals half a sausage from an unattended cart with astonishing professionalism. Inside again, conversation drifts towards stories of women disguised as men to travel safely between towns or join pilgrimages forbidden by family members. Most tales sound exaggerated, though perhaps not entirely impossible. One merchant swears he once met a woman dressed as a novice monk crossing the northern hills. Another insists highway spirits lure solitary women from roads after dark. No one can quite agree where truth ends and fearful imagination begins along winter travel routes. As night approaches, the innkeeper announces that the gates of the nearby town will close before full dark due to recent thefts along the road. Immediately, several women travellers gather their belongings with visible urgency. Men complain. Women hurry. The distinction says enough. You continue with the evening caravan toward the town walls visible faintly through rising mist. Torches flicker atop the gatehouse while guards prepare to close the heavy doors for the night. A young servant girl walking ahead stumbles in the mud, dropping a basket of candles into slush. She kneels desperately trying to salvage them before curfew bells ring. Late arrival means questions. Questions mean suspicion. Agnes quietly helps her gather the ruined candles while the girl whispers frantic thanks. Then together you pass beneath the closing gates into another winter town where smoke hangs low beneath the rooftops and bells mark the end of safe travelling hours. Behind you, the dark road disappears slowly beneath fresh snow. And you understand more clearly now that medieval restrictions upon women's movement are not only written by laws or church decrees, sometimes they're enforced simply by the dangerous shape of the world itself. The town settles uneasily after dark. Snowmelt drips from the gatehouse while torchlight trembles across muddy streets lined with shuttered workshops and crooked timber homes. Somewhere a baby cries through thin walls. Somewhere else a drunk man sings half a hymn and half a tavern song with admirable commitment to neither. You follow Agnes through narrow lanes toward the ale quarter near the river docks, where brewers, ferrymen, fishmongers, and carters crowd together beneath hanging signs blackened by smoke and weather. The air smells strongly of yeast, wet rope, stale ale, and river mud. A comforting combination if you have been travelling long enough. The inn here is larger than the roadside tavern, though only slightly cleaner. Rushes cover the floor thickly enough to hide generations of spilled drink beneath them. Beeswax candles flicker inside green glass holders, while a fire roars in the hearth large enough to roast a sheep or several unfortunate arguments. Women move everywhere through the room, serving ale, collecting trenchers, sweeping floors, brewing behind the rear partition, and immediately you notice something interesting. Unlike many other trades, brewing often belongs partly to women, or at least it once did more openly. Agnes points toward the broad-shouldered woman supervising the ale barrels near the hearth. Her sleeves are rolled high, revealing flour dust and burn marks across her forearms. Several men greet her respectfully as Mistress Anne. She brews half the ale in this quarter, Agnes says quietly. Indeed, alewives and female brewers remain common in many towns, especially among poorer households where brewing provides essential income. Women produce ale for homes, markets, and inns alike. Some become highly skilled, balancing herbs, grain quality, fermentation, and storage with near magical precision. Because frankly, medieval drinking water often behaves like it holds personal grudges. All is safer. Mostly, yet success brings its own dangers. You soon overhear two merchants complaining near the fire that women brewers grow too bold when profits rise. Guild regulations tighten in larger towns. Taxes increase. Licenses become harder to obtain. Economic competition disguises itself conveniently as moral concern. Mistress Anne herself snorts when hearing the complaints. Funny, she mutters while hammering a barrel tap into place. Nobody objects when thirsty. The room erupts briefly with laughter. Still, you notice she remains careful, confident but measured. Public women who work visibly among strangers, walk a fragile line between usefulness and suspicion, especially inside alehouses. At one table sits a group of sailors loudly debating whether women bring bad luck aboard ships. Opinions vary wildly depending upon how much ale each man has consumed. One insists women anger storms. Another claims his aunt captained a river barge for 20 years without sinking once. The third has fallen asleep face first into turnip stew and contributes little to maritime scholarship. Near the hearth, a young serving woman accidentally brushes against a merchant while carrying drinks. His companions immediately exchange knowing grins. A tiny mistake becomes performance. A reminder that women inside public spaces are constantly observed, interpreted, discussed. Agnes quietly explains that respectable women are expected to avoid lingering too freely in taverns unless working, travelling with family, or conducting necessary business. Too much presence in alehouses may damage reputation quickly. Too much laughter, too much confidence, too much visibility. The rules return again and again like bells marking the hours. At supper, thick barley stew arrives with smoked river fish and coarse bread dark as oak bark. Steam fogs the low rafters while travellers warm frozen hands beside the fire. The one-eared dog receives scraps from half the room after successfully pretending starvation for the third time today. A natural actor. Conversation turns toward punishments used in nearby towns for women accused of public disorder, gossiping excessively, fighting, scolding husbands too loudly, selling weak ale dishonestly. Accusations vary. One ferryman describes seeing a cucking stool once beside a riverbank farther south. A dreadful wooden chair used to dunk offenders repeatedly into cold water before crowds of spectators. Even describing it makes several women nearby fall silent. Mistress Anne bangs another barrel shut hard enough to interrupt the conversation entirely. No shortage of foolish punishments in this world, she says sharply. Nobody argues. Outside, curfew bells ring through the snow-heavy streets. Shutters close one by one while guards patrol the lanes carrying lanterns through drifting fog. Yet the alehouse remains alive deep into the night. Here news travels faster than carts. A brewer complains about new licensing fees. A widow bargains quietly for grain deliveries. A laundress shares rumours of women fined for selling ale without male oversight in a nearby town. Some swear authorities fear dishonest brewing practices. Others insist successful alewives simply threaten established merchants. Those who tell the stories never fully agree. Near midnight, music begins softly near the hearth. A fiddler plays while travellers sing low winter ballads about lost rivers, absent lovers, and saints who apparently solve every problem except taxes. You notice several women singing too, though more quietly than the men. Present. Careful. Measured. Always measured. Then a sudden argument flares near the rear table where a drunken cooper accuses his wife of embarrassing him publicly by contradicting him earlier at market. The room stills immediately, not because arguments are rare, because hers occurred in Publix. The woman stands rigid beside the bench, cheeks flushed with anger and humiliation. "You were wrong," she says flatly. The cooper laughs sharply. "Not your place to say." Simple words again. Always simple. Yet heavy as iron keys. Mistress Anne crosses the room before the quarrel worsens. She plants both hands on the table and stares the cooper down with the calm fury of a woman who has spent years surviving noisy men and burning kettles alike. "Either drink quietly," she says, "or freeze outside." A long silence follows. Then the cooper sits down, muttering into his ale. The room exhales collectively. You realize then that women often protect one another here in subtle ways: interruptions, warnings, shared glances, quiet assistance. Small shields against a world eager to judge loudly and forgive slowly. Later, as the fire burns low and travellers drift towards sleeping lofts above the common room, Agnes sits beside the fading embers, turning an empty cup slowly between her hands. "Public life belongs mostly to men," she says quietly, "but women still live inside it every day. Around you, benches scrape softly across rushes while candlelight flickers against smoke-dark beams overhead. Outside, snow falls again beyond the shutters, covering muddy streets and frozen roofs in silence. And inside the warm, crowded alehouse, where women may brew the drink yet still risk shame for standing too visibly among strangers, you continue seeing how medieval society builds invisible boundaries around even the most ordinary moments of public life. Morning arrives with the smell of yeast, wood smoke, and river fog creeping beneath the alehouse door. The common room looks gentler in daylight. Tankards stand overturned beside crumbs of black bread while embers glow faintly beneath the hearth ash. A serving girl scatters fresh rushes across the floor to cover spilled ale and muddy footprints from the night before. The one-eared dog sleeps beneath a bench so deeply you suspect nothing short of trumpet blasts or falling livestock could disturb him. Outside, the river moves dark and slow beneath floating sheets of ice. Barges creak softly against wooden posts while gulls wheel overhead, crying into the cold air. Women already gather near the dockside market wrapped in layered wool cloaks, trading herbs, candles, dried onions, and winter remedies beside steaming cook fires. Agnes wishes to visit a healer living beyond the town palisade before continuing her journey east. Her cousin's child suffers from a lingering chest sickness, and rumours speak of a woman skilled with herbs and poultices near the riverside marsh. Rumours naturally also claim she speaks with ravens. Medieval reputations rarely settle for moderation. You follow a narrow path beyond the town ditch where reeds sway stiffly beneath frost, and smoke rises from scattered cottages crouched low against the wind. Somewhere distant, bells mark terse prayers from a chapel hidden among bare trees. The healer's cottage stands alone near the marsh edge. Bundles of drying plants hang beneath the roof eaves: sage, thyme, yarrow, mugwort, lavender. Bones of fish and small animals dangle from cords beside tiny carved wooden charms darkened by smoke and weather. A black cat watches from the doorway with profound disappointment in humanity. Inside smells overwhelm you immediately. Rosemary, vinegar, wet earth, burned honey, boiling herbs, something bitter underneath everything else. The healer herself appears elderly enough to remember the invention of winter. Her grey braid hangs nearly to her waist and her hands bear greenish stains from crushed plants. Shelves line the walls holding clay jars, beeswax candles, dried roots, folded cloths, tiny relic boxes, and bundles of leeches floating lazily in cloudy water. You try not to look directly at the leeches. They notice. Agnes explains the child's illness while the healer listens silently beside the hearth. Finally, she begins preparing a remedy involving honey, thyme, onion syrup, and heated wine. Practical medicine in the medieval world often belongs largely to women. Midwives, herb wives, nurses, caretakers. Women preserve generations of knowledge regarding childbirth, fevers, poultices, digestion, wounds, sleeping draughts, and bone setting. Most households rely heavily upon female healing traditions simply to survive ordinary life. And yet, authority again becomes complicated. Official medicine increasingly shifts toward universities, church oversight, and formally trained male physicians in larger towns. Women may heal quietly within villages, but public recognition often arrives tangled with suspicion, especially when treatments succeed too well, or fail too visibly. The healer crushes herbs carefully with the stone mortar while speaking in a low, steady voice. People trust remedies, she says, until they fear them. She gestures toward a shelf crowded with tiny charms sewn from cloth. Protective tokens, birthing amulets, prayer knots, objects resting uneasily between folk custom and church approval. Some swear iron nails beneath the bedward off fever spirits. Others insist dried fox lungs cure coughs if hung above the hearth during snowfall. No one can quite agree whether these practices heal bodies or simply comfort frightened minds through long winters. Perhaps both matter. A knock sounds suddenly at the cottage door. A young pregnant woman enters supported by her mother. Fear shadows both their faces. The healer guides them toward stools beside the fire while preparing warm cloths and fragrant oil. You quickly understand that midwifery occupies especially dangerous ground for medieval women. Birth belongs primarily to women's spaces. Midwives assist labouring mothers, prepare remedies, offer prayers, and sometimes even perform emergency baptisms for dying infants when priests cannot arrive in time. Communities depend upon them desperately. Yet if childbirth goes poorly, and often it does, blame may follow swiftly afterward. Too much knowledge appears suspicious. Too little becomes incompetence. The line between respected healer and feared cunning woman shifts constantly beneath changing moods, grief, superstition, and gossip. While the pregnant woman rests, the healer quietly shows Agnes jars of dried herbs stacked carefully near the hearth. Willow bark for pain, comfrey for bruises, garlic steeped in vinegar against infection, dried mint for stomach illness. Real practical knowledge hidden beneath layers of ritual and folklore. Yet outside official institutions, outside universities, outside recognition, you ask whether physicians from town object to her work. The old healer smiles faintly. Physicians visit after rich men fall ill, she says. Villagers come here first. A fair point. Outside, snow begins drifting lightly across the marsh reeds again. Ravens circle above the frozen river banks while smoke curls low over distant rooftops beyond the town walls. Inside the cottage, the healer lights a beeswax candle before a tiny saint carving darkened by soot. Beside it hangs a pouch filled with rowan berries and iron nails. Christian prayer and ancient folk practice sit side by side here without much concern for theological neatness. A dangerous balance sometimes. Agnes later whispers that another healer farther south was accused of witchcraft after several cattle died during a harsh winter. Nothing proven. Nothing entirely disproven either. Fear travels quickly through hungry villages, especially toward women who live alone, heal mysteriously, or refuse ordinary expectations. Even now, it is hard to tell where superstition ends and social control begins. By afternoon, the pregnant woman departs carrying herbal bundles wrapped carefully in cloth. Snowflakes melt across her cloak while her mother presses extra coins into the healer's hands with desperate gratitude. The old woman watches them leave in silence, then quietly places iron shears beneath the doormat. For wandering spirits, she explains, you suspect they would also discourage wandering thieves reasonably well. As evening approaches, marsh fog thickens around the cottage until the outside world fades into pale grey shadow. The fire crackles softly while herb bundles sway overhead like sleeping birds. The healer sits beside the hearth sorting dried lavender into tiny linen packets. Men fear women who know hidden things, she says eventually. Not bitterly. Just tired. Around her rests an entire world of female knowledge remedies, births, fevers, comforts, rituals preserved largely through memory and practice rather than official authority. Necessary knowledge. Untrusted knowledge. And as darkness gathers quietly across the frozen marshlands, you begin understanding why so many medieval women walk carefully around the edges of power itself. Because healing hands, in the wrong eyes, may easily become dangerous hands. Snow turns to rain before dawn. Cold drops strike the healer's roof steadily through the night until the marsh paths dissolve into slick black mud by morning. Fog hangs low over the reeds, swallowing distant trees and softening the river into a pale ribbon barely visible beyond the cattails. The healer sends you onward after a breakfast of coarse bread dipped in onion broth. Agnes wraps the medicinal bundles carefully beneath her cloak, while the old woman presses dried lavender into your hand against bad sleep and worse company. The one-eared dog eats half your breakfast during the exchange. A deeply medieval betrayal. You follow the road eastward through dripping woodland until, sometime near midday, the trees finally open onto rolling estates surrounding a noble manor perched above frost-dark fields. Stone towers rise behind timber palisades while banners snap weakly in the damp wind. Servants hurry between storehouses carrying baskets, kindling, salted fish, and bolts of cloth before another storm arrives. The manor glows with wealth compared to the villages behind you. Not comfort necessarily, just wealth. A gate steward allows travellers temporary shelter because Agnes carries a letter bearing the seal of distant relatives employed in the household kitchens. So you pass beneath the torchlit archway into a world of polished oak doors, iron chandeliers, and walls draped with faded hunting tapestries. Inside the great hall, warmth rushes over you in heavy waves scented with roasted meat, beeswax, damp hounds, and expensive spices sharp enough to sting your nose. A fire large enough to cremate poor decisions roars beneath the chimney hood, while servants move constantly through the room carrying trenchers, wine cups, towels, and steaming platters. At the high table sits the lord's family, and immediately you notice another layer of restriction unfolding. Noble women possess richer clothing, finer food, softer beds, better education in certain arts, perhaps even greater influence within households. Yet they remain bound tightly all the same. Silk curtains still form walls. A young noblewoman embroiders beside the hearth beneath candlelight, while older relatives discuss land agreements nearby. Pearls decorate her sleeves. Gold thread glimmers at her collar. Yet when conversation turns toward inheritance dispute with neighbouring lords, she falls silent immediately despite clearly following every detail. Her marriage, you gather, is already under negotiation. Not primarily for affection, for alliance, for property, for advantage, like a carefully positioned chess piece wrapped in velvet. A steward later explains proudly that noble daughters are expected to master music, embroidery, household management, prayer, manners, perhaps some reading in French or Latin if fortunate.
But hunting rare?
Formal political authority limited. Military command nearly impossible except under extraordinary circumstances. Inheritance itself often favours male heirs heavily unless necessity intervenes. Some noble women become powerful regents or estate managers, especially during wars or widowhood. A few even influence kings quietly through marriage alliances or court politics. But these exceptions stand out precisely because the system resists them. The hall fills gradually toward evening as retainers return from inspecting winter storehouses. Rainwater drips from cloaks onto rush-covered floors, while servants refill cups with dark wine and spiced ale. Women move everywhere here too. Lady attendants, kitchen workers, seamstresses, nursemaids, washwomen, silent girls carrying candles through the corridors. Yet public prestige belongs mostly to men seated nearest the Lord's chair. At supper, roasted pheasant arrives alongside fresh trenchers, onion tarts, spiced pears, and white bread so soft it feels nearly sinful after weeks of coarse rye crusts. Noble dining possesses many rituals, hand-washing before meals, carefully arranged seating, controlled conversation, proper carving etiquette, and beneath it all, endless observation. A noble woman's posture, speech, laughter, appetite, every gesture quietly measured. The young embroidered lady finally speaks once during the meal, offering an opinion regarding the management of sheep flocks near the western fields. She speaks intelligently and briefly. An older knight smiles indulgently. Very clever, he says, before immediately returning to conversation with the men beside him. The dismissal lands gently enough to avoid open insult, which somehow makes it worse. Later, musicians play softly beside the fire while noble guests discuss falconry, border disputes, and winter taxes. The women embroider, spin thread, or pour wine while conversation flows around them like a river, carefully avoiding certain stones. Agnes whispers that noble women often face strict expectations regarding behaviour and appearance. Too outspoken becomes improper, too independent invites rumour, too educated unsettles insecure men, too friendly risks scandal, too cold risks insult. A narrow bridge again. Always narrow. Near the far hearth hangs hunting equipment, bows, spears, leather gloves for falcons, riding cloaks lined with fox fur. Noble hunting remains prestigious, symbolic of authority and status. Women may occasionally participate in smaller hunts or hawking, but major hunts largely remain male territory tied to warfare, land rights, and aristocratic identity. One lord boasts loudly about boar hunting while the young noblewoman beside him quietly stitches silver thread into a tapestry depicting exactly such a hunt, recording glory rather than joining it. Some swear certain queens once rode into battle wearing armour beneath velvet cloaks. Others insist women who pursued warfare invited divine punishment. Those who tell the stories never fully agree. As evening deepens, candles multiply across the hall until golden light dances against polished goblets and smoke-dark beams overhead. Rain lashes softly against the shutters, while hounds sleep beside the fire, dreaming perhaps of chasing extremely slow peasants. You wander briefly through the side corridors where servants prepare sleeping chambers upstairs. Here noble women's lives reveal another contradiction. Rich fabrics, heated rooms, fine combs carved from ivory, imported perfumes, illuminated prayer books, and constant supervision, chaperones, marriage negotiations, inheritance pressures, expectations surrounding fertility, obedience, court manners, and family honour. A gilded cage remains a cage. Near midnight, the young noblewoman steps briefly onto the gallery overlooking the dark courtyard below. Rain gleams across the cobblestones while stable lanterns flicker through the mist. "I would rather travel," she says quietly to no one in particular, then almost immediately glances around as though worried the walls themselves overheard. Below, servants continue hauling supplies through the rain while bells ring faintly from a distant monastery hidden beyond the hills. Inside the manor, tapestries sway gently in the draughty warmth, while noble life settles into its endless rituals of rank and restraint. And as you lie awake beneath thick wool blankets listening to the storm against the tower walls, you begin to understand that medieval women are not divided simply into free and unfree. Sometimes privilege merely changes the shape of the boundaries surrounding you. The rain finally breaks sometime before dawn, leaving the manor grounds wrapped in silver mist and dripping silence. Water slides steadily from the eaves into flooded courtyards, while servants scatter fresh straw across the mud to keep carts from sinking too deeply. Beyond the walls, fields stretch pale and frozen beneath low clouds where crows gather like scraps of torn cloth. You wake to distant bells and the smell of oat bread baking somewhere below stairs. The manor household already hums with labour. Kitchen fires roar. Stable boys shovel dung into steaming heaps. Maidservants beat dust from blankets along the gallery railings. And beyond the walls, peasants move slowly across winter fields carrying tools over their shoulders like tired soldiers, marching toward another small battle with the earth. Agnes wishes to continue eastward after breakfast, but the steward warns that recent rains have turned the lower roads nearly impassable. Travel must wait until midday, so you spend the morning watching manor life unfold between hall and field. It becomes impossible to ignore how heavily medieval survival depends upon women's labour, yet equally impossible to ignore how rarely that labour grants authority in return. From the manor gallery you see peasant women already working in the open fields despite the bitter cold. Cloaks whip in the wind while hands reddened by frost gather winter vegetables from muddy rows or scatter feed across frozen ground. One woman hauls firewood bundled with rope across her back while balancing a sleeping infant against her hip. No audience applauds this endurance. No songs celebrate it. The work simply continues because hunger waits patiently for no one. Later you walk beyond the manor gate toward the tenant fields where villagers repair fences damaged during recent storms. Wet earth sucks greedily at your boots with every step. The one-eared dog charges through puddles joyfully, entirely untroubled by dignity. A wise philosophy. Near a collapsed stone wall, several women stack firewood while men argue nearby over ox harness repairs. One older woman directs the labour quietly with obvious competence. Yet when the reeve arrives asking about timber allocations, he speaks only to the men. The woman merely rolls her eyes and keeps working. You begin noticing this pattern everywhere now. Women managing practical survival. Men formally representing authority. A peasant named Elsworth invites you briefly into her cottage to warm beside the hearth. The interior smells of cabbage soup, damp wool, smoke, and sheep grease rubbed into cracked leather boots. Chickens wander freely near the doorway while strips of salted turnip hang drying from the rafters. Her hands bear deep calluses from years of field labour. "People think women stay indoors," she says while kneading coarse dough upon a wooden board. "I would like to meet these women someday." Outside the cottage, you already saw her hauling water, feeding hens, chopping roots, mending nets, and carrying peat fuel from the marsh path. And soon she will return to the fields. Peasant women work constantly across nearly every aspect of rural life planting, harvesting, milking, brewing, spinning, tending gardens, caring for animals, gathering firewood, preparing food, repairing clothing, raising children. Yet ownership remains elusive. Land usually passes through male inheritance lines. Manor obligations recognize male household heads first. Tools, oxen, ploughs, and legal authority often remained tied to husbands or fathers even when women share the labour equally. Sometimes more than equally. At midday, bells echo faintly across the valley while villagers gather near communal ovens carrying rough loaves wrapped in cloth. Smoke curls upward into pale sunlight breaking weakly through the clouds. An old man beside the ovens complains that younger women grow too opinionated nowadays because several widows recently petitioned the manor steward regarding unfair grain dues. Elswith snorts loudly enough for half the yard to hear. Opinionated, she mutters, meaning hungry. A dangerous kind of truth. You walk later through frost-dark orchards where women prune dead branches using iron knives dulled from years of work. Nearby, girls gather fallen twigs for fuel while singing softly beneath their breath. One child asked whether noble ladies truly wear silk even while sleeping. Another wonders if city women actually own shoes without holes. Medieval dreams remain practical. Agnes quietly explains that peasant women sometimes appear to possess greater daily freedom of movement than noble women simply because survival requires it. They work fields, visit markets, gather resources, tend animals, and travel between holdings regularly. But necessity should not be mistaken for power. If harvests fail, women suffer first beside children and the elderly. If husbands die, land rights become uncertain. If disputes arise before manor courts, male testimony often outweighs theirs. Freedom measured entirely by exhaustion is not freedom at all. Near the edge of the field stands a weathered roadside cross wrapped with faded ribbons and tiny wooden charms. Elswith pauses there briefly while carrying grain sacks. For the milk cows, she explains after touching the wood lightly. Some swear tying ribbons beside field shrines protects livestock from sickness and barren winters. Others insist crows carry curses across failed harvests unless driven away with iron bells before sunset. No one can quite agree whether faith here grows more from devotion or desperation. Probably they intertwine too deeply to separate. As afternoon fades, clouds break enough to spill pale gold light across the muddy valley. Smoke drifts lazily from cottage roofs while distant monastery bells call the evening prayers once again. You help carry turnips into a winter storehouse dug partly underground beside the manor barns. Inside smells of damp earth, onions, old straw, and cold stone. Women sort spoiled vegetables from healthy ones by candlelight while discussing births, illnesses, weather signs, and rumours from neighbouring villages. One woman quietly mentions hearing of a widow denied use of her late husband's plough team because male relatives claimed ownership after his death. Another shrugs grimly. Happens often enough. The conversation continues without surprise. That perhaps unsettles you most. How ordinary these limits feel within daily life. Not dramatic tyranny, just endless narrowing. As darkness gathers over the fields, villagers return slowly toward cottages glowing warm behind horn windows. Boots scrape mud from thresholds. Soup simmers over hearths. Children fall asleep beside spinning wheels while rainwater drips steadily from cloaks hung near the fire. And through the quiet rhythm of rural evening, you see clearly now that medieval women are forbidden not only from grand public authority, but often from claiming ownership over the very labour that keeps the world alive around them. The cold deepens sharply overnight. By dawn the manor ponds wear skins of brittle ice, and every fence rail sparkles white beneath heavy frost. Smoke rises straight upward into the pale morning sky, while the fields beyond the estate lie hard and silent under winter light. You and Agnes leave the manor after first bell. The steward provides coarse bread, smoked eel wrapped in cloth, and directions toward the eastern road that winds through smaller farming villages along the river valley. The one-eared dog follows without invitation, now fully convinced he belongs to your travelling company forever. A questionable but touching decision. The road narrows quickly beyond the manor lands. Frost crunches beneath your boots while crows pick through frozen stubble fields beside low stone walls. Here the world feels quieter than the crowded market towns behind you. Smoke drifts from isolated cottages tucked among bare orchards and muddy paddocks, where thin cattle huddle together against the wind. Near midday you arrive at a widow's holding perched beside a willow-lined stream. The cottage itself leans slightly with age. Its thatched roof sags beneath moss and old snow, while bundles of onions and garlic hang drying beneath the eaves. Yet despite its humble appearance, the place feels orderly. Wood stacked neatly, tools repaired carefully, chickens fed, winter cabbages stored beneath straw-covered pits. A household surviving through discipline. The widow, Matilda, greets Agnes warmly and insists travellers share her fire until the evening frost eases. Inside, warmth gathers beneath soot-dark rafters, where herbs dry beside strings of rabbit pelts. A small iron pot simmers over the hearth, sending up the comforting smell of barley and leeks. You notice immediately that Matilda moves differently than many married women you've met. More directly, more openly. She speaks without glancing toward a husband for approval because no husband remains. Widowhood changes things. Not completely, but enough. As you warm your hands beside the fire, Matilda explains that her husband died during a river fever 3 winters earlier. Since then she's managed the cottage, negotiated rents, supervised labour exchanges with neighbours, sold eggs at market, and defended her small property rights before manor officials. All while learning the exciting mystery, she says dryly, of why every wheel breaks only during storms. At last true medieval wisdom. Yet beneath the humour lies exhaustion. Widowhood sometimes grants women freedoms unavailable during marriage. A widow may control dowry property temporarily, oversee business matters, make contracts, travel more independently, or manage household finances directly. People listen differently to widows. Not always respectfully, but differently. Because society no longer knows precisely where to place them. Some widows become prosperous traders, brewers, or land managers. Others fall rapidly into poverty once male protection disappears. Everything depends upon inheritance arrangements, surviving relatives, debts, local customs, and simple luck. A fragile kind of freedom. Matilda shows you the tiny chest containing her legal documents, rent agreements, tax tallies, inventory lists scratched by a local scribe onto rough parchment. These matter now, she says quietly. During marriage, many such dealings passed formally through her husband's hands. Now every negotiation arrives at her own door instead. And not everyone approves. She explains that neighbouring men sometimes attempt to pressure widows into remarriage simply to absorb property, labour, or livestock into another household. Others challenge women's authority openly, assuming widows cannot manage fields or contract properly. Funny, Matilda mutters while sharpening a kitchen knife beside the hearth. Nobody questioned my abilities when the cows needed milking at dawn. Outside, afternoon light spreads pale gold across the frozen stream. A pair of village boys help repair a fence while Matilda directs them briskly through the window. Neither seems surprised to receive orders from her. Practical necessity often overrides social discomfort eventually, at least until inheritance becomes involved. Later, while carrying firewood from the shed, Matilda points toward a neighbouring holding abandoned after another widow lost legal disputes with her husband's brothers. They said she needed male guidance, Matilda says flatly. The cottage now stands empty beneath drifting snow. A lesson visible from her own doorway every morning. Inside again, Agnes helps prepare supper while Matilda sorts dried herbs into tiny linen sacks for market trade. Lavender, sage, chamomile. She sells them quietly alongside eggs and spun wool to supplement winter income. Not officially as a guild member, of course. Widows often survive through grey spaces between formal rules. One must become adaptable. Near dusk, several neighbouring women arrive carrying mending work and gossip wrapped together with equal importance. Candles flicker softly while needles flash through wool sleeves and patched cloaks. Conversation drifts toward village rumours. A widow farther south accused of withholding rents. Another pressured into remarriage by her late husband's cousin. A third managing an alehouse successfully enough to provoke resentment from local merchants. Some swear widows enjoy dangerous independence once freed from husbands. Others insist loneliness devours them slowly like rot beneath floorboards. Those who tell the stories never fully agree. Matilda herself listens quietly before speaking. People romanticize freedom when they do not have to chop firewood alone. Silence follows briefly. Then someone laughs softly into her stitching. Outside, frost thickens across the fields while bells echo faintly from a distant chapel hidden somewhere beyond the hills. Smoke presses low beneath the night sky, and the frozen stream creaks gently beside the cottage wall. After supper, Matilda unlocks the door herself with a heavy iron key hanging from her belt. You notice the motion immediately. Simple, ordinary, yet deeply meaningful after everything you have seen. The key belongs to her now. Still, freedom here remains conditional, vulnerable, balanced carefully atop uncertain legal customs and fragile economic survival. Widowhood grants authority only because death removes the structure that previously denied it. A strange bargain indeed. Before sleep, Matilda places bread crusts upon the windowsill for wandering souls caught outdoors in winter. Whether meant for spirits, birds, or memories, you cannot entirely tell. The one-eared dog curls beside the hearth with profound satisfaction, while snow begins falling lightly beyond the shutters once more. And inside the warm, lonely cottage of a woman who gained certain freedoms only through loss, you begin understanding how medieval society sometimes allowed women small pieces of authority, but often only after sorrow had already taken nearly everything else first. Snow whispers softly against the shutters through the night. By morning, the widow's cottage feels wrapped inside a world of pale silence, where even the frozen stream outside moves more quietly beneath its crust of ice. Smoke curls upward from the chimney into a white sky, and somewhere far across the valley, monastery bells drift faintly through the snowfall like echoes from another century entirely. Matilda rises before dawn, of course. Everyone does here except saints, cats, and apparently the one-eared dog. He remains asleep beside the hearth with such absolute commitment that you briefly wonder whether he has entered a spiritual vocation. Inside the cottage, candlelight glows warmly against rough timber walls, while Matilda kneads barley dough upon a flour-dusted board. Agnes helps bundle herbs for market trade, tying lavender and rosemary into neat little bunches bound with red thread. Red thread again. You've seen it in weaving houses, birthing charms, roadside shrines, even hanging beside cattle stalls. Some swear red wards away envy and evil spirits alike. Others insist it merely helps people feel less helpless during long winters when children cough through the night and wolves wander too close to villages. No one can quite agree. The snow eases by midday, and you continue eastward along a narrow pilgrim path threading through woods dark with pine and bare oak. Frost sparkles upon the branches while ravens flap overhead against the pale sky. The road feels older here somehow, worn smooth by generations of travellers carrying prayers, fears, and aching feet between shrines. At the edge of the forest stand a roadside chapel scarcely larger than a cottage. Candles flicker behind horn windows. Tiny offerings crowd the doorway ribbons, carved wooden saints, iron nails, scraps of cloth, dried flowers, even a child's worn leather shoe left carefully beneath the shrine cross. Faith and superstition live side by side here without much concern for sorting themselves properly. An elderly woman tends the chapel fire while muttering prayers beneath her breath. She welcomes travellers warmly enough and offers watered ale heated with cloves against the cold. Inside the chapel walls hang faded paintings of female saints martyrs, queens, abbesses, virgins carrying lilies or books or tiny churches in their hands, women celebrated for holiness. Yet even here, beneath images of revered women, restrictions remain visible. The old caretaker explains that women may clean altars, light candles, maintain shrines, organize feast preparations, and devote entire lives to prayer. But sacred authority still belongs elsewhere. No woman preaches from the pulpit, she says matter-of-factly while trimming a candle wick. The words fall softly into the warm chapel air. Outside, snow slides from pine branches in heavy sighing clumps while travellers pause briefly at the shrine before continuing onward. A young village girl enters carrying a basket of eggs as an offering for St. Margaret, protector of childbirth and women in labour. She kneels carefully before the painted saint and whispers prayers too quietly to hear. Then, after checking whether anyone watches, she ties a tiny ribbon around the statue's wrist. Official religion rarely approves such folk customs entirely, yet people continue them anyway, especially women, quietly. Across centuries, the caretaker later tells stories while feeding sticks into the fire, tales of women who disguised themselves as pilgrims to escape forced marriages, women who secretly learned letters from sympathetic monks, women who fled abusive households and vanished into convents beneath assumed names. Some stories sound possible. Others feel shaped by winter fires and lonely roads. One tale especially lingers. Long ago, according to the caretaker, a nobleman's daughter refused marriage and disguised herself in men's clothing to travel among scholars in distant cities. Some swear she succeeded for years before discovery. Others insist wolves devoured her in the mountains as punishment for pride. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. Agnes smiles faintly afterward. Funny how rebellious women in stories always end dramatically. Perhaps quiet survival simply makes poorer legends. As afternoon fades, you continue along the forest path toward another village barely visible through drifting snow. Travellers pass occasionally monks, merchants, peasants carrying firewood sleds, and women, always women moving carefully through the world. A young mother balancing a child and water pails, an elderly herb seller muttering charms beneath her breath. Two sisters walking swiftly before dark because respectable women should not remain outdoors after curfew bells. The rules never entirely disappear, even far from towns. At dusk you shelter briefly beneath a wooden wayside shrine where candle smoke stains the beams black above travellers' heads. Symbols carved into the wood overlap strangely crosses beside older-looking spiral marks worn nearly smooth by time. The caretaker from the chapel catches up, eventually carrying bundles beneath her cloak. People remember older things, she says quietly while watching snow drift across the road. You ask what she means. She shrugs. Women always find hidden ways to keep knowledge alive. Her voice carries no drama, only certainty. You think then of the healer's herb jars, the woven protection knots, the widow's iron key, the market women whispering warnings to daughters, the noble girl longing quietly for roads beyond the manor walls. Small acts. Hidden acts. tiny resistances woven invisibly through ordinary life. Perhaps that is how many medieval women survive restrictions that seem impossible to escape outright, not through grand rebellion, but through persistence passed carefully from one generation to the next like smuggled candle flame. Night gathers slowly around the road. Snow absorbs sound until even footsteps seem muted beneath the trees. Somewhere distant, wolves howl faintly across the hills, though perhaps it is only wind moving through frozen branches. Even now, it is hard to tell. The village ahead glows softly with hearthlight shining through horn windows. Smoke drifts upward into the darkening sky while bells ring the evening hour from some unseen chapel deeper in the valley. And as you walk onward through the quiet, snowy world, surrounded by whispers of women who bent rules, preserved hidden knowledge, or quietly slipped beyond expected boundaries, you begin understanding that medieval history remembers authority loudly, but often remembers resistance only in murmurs beside the fire. The bells reach you before the town does. Low and distant through the winter dark, they drift across the valley in slow waves while snow falls softly over the road ahead. The forest thins at last, opening onto familiar walls rising beside the river, where smoke curls upward into the cold evening sky. Torchlight glows faintly along the gatehouse, warm and golden against wet stone. You have come full circle. The same town where this long wandering began now waits quietly beyond the snow. Yet it no longer feels entirely the same. Your boots crunch slowly across the frozen road, while the one-eared dog trots faithfully beside you, muzzle powdered white with frost. Agnes walks in silence beneath her heavy cloak, tired now from days of travel and winter air. Around you the medieval world settles towards sleep. Carts creak toward barns. Shutters close against the wind. Women hurry home carrying baskets before curfew bells finish ringing. The familiar rhythm returns again and again like prayer. At the gatehouse, guards inspect travellers beneath swaying lanterns just as they did that first night. A young woman carrying firewood receives questions before entering. An old merchant passes almost unnoticed. Somewhere nearby a child coughs beneath blankets while horses stamp clouds of steam into the cold. Nothing dramatic changes. That, perhaps, is the strangest thing. All these roads, monasteries, markets, cottages, and halls have shown you how deeply the boundaries surrounding medieval women sink into ordinary life itself, into doors, into laws, into church rituals, into inheritance customs, into market rules and marriage contracts and public glances and whispered gossip beside bake-ovens. Restrictions woven so tightly into daily existence that many people barely seem to notice them anymore. Inside the town walls, evening settles gently over the streets. Snowmelt drips from roof edges into frozen gutters, while candles glow behind shutters like tiny stars trapped inside timber frames. The smell of smoke, wet wool, onions, and baking rye bread drifts softly through the cold air. You pass again through the market square where stalls now stand empty beneath snow-covered awnings. The fountain at the centre wears a ring of ice around its moss-dark stones. Nearby, a brewer's wife locks her workshop door while two girls carry unsold turnips home beneath wool cloaks. Present everywhere, still watched, still necessary, still restricted. At the alehouse near the river, laughter murmurs softly behind shuttered windows. Somewhere inside, perhaps Mistress Anne still pounds barrel taps into place while travellers trade stories beside the fire. Perhaps another serving girl carefully balances friendliness against caution. Perhaps another woman lowers her voice simply because men have entered the room. The habits continue. At the Abbey Hill beyond town, bells answer one another through the falling snow. You imagine the scriptorium glowing warmly behind narrow windows where monks bend over manuscripts most women will never read. Yet perhaps somewhere nearby, a nun still copies hidden knowledge quietly by candlelight. Small embers beneath ash. Always there. You walk slowly now. The pace of the world itself seems to soften around you. Near the manor court, snow gathers along the empty benches where accusations and judgments once echoed through crowded halls. Tomorrow another woman may stand there defending her reputation, her property, her voice, or simply her right to exist outside expectation. And still life will continue afterward. Children fed, bread baked, fields planted, candles trimmed. The medieval world survives largely because women hold it together with tired hands nobody fully acknowledges. The thought follows you quietly through the snowy lanes. Agnes eventually stops beside a narrow bridge overlooking the dark river. Ice drifts slowly through the current beneath pale moonlight while reeds whisper along the frozen banks. For all the rules, she says softly, women still endure. No bitterness. No triumph. Just truth worn smooth by time. The one-eared dog sits beside you, both watching snowflakes disappear into the water. Around the bridge stand tiny offerings tied to the railing, faded ribbons, scraps of cloth, little iron nails blackened by weather, prayers left behind by travellers fearful of illness, hunger, childbirth, winter storms, lonely roads. Human hopes rarely change much across centuries. The bells ring again. Slower now. Softer. You continue walking through the quiet town while snow thickens gently around the rooftops and chimneys. Somewhere a mother hums a lullaby behind shuttered windows. Somewhere an old widow locks her door with an iron key hanging proudly at her waist. Somewhere a healer dries herbs above her hearth, while hoping suspicion never arrives at her threshold. Somewhere a girl secretly traces letters into candle soot because knowledge itself feels precious. The roads continue, the rules continue, and still, quietly, life continues too. At last you return to the same alehouse where your journey first began. The common room glows warm beneath soot-dark rafters, while travellers sleep beside the fire wrapped in wool blankets, smelling faintly of smoke and winter rain. A serving woman places fresh rushes upon the floor. Someone snores gently near the hearth. The world feels smaller now, quieter. You settle onto a rough bench beside the fading embers while snow brushes softly against the shutters outside. The dog curls immediately beside your boots with complete trust. The fire crackles low, candles shorten, voices fade, and the medieval world that once felt crowded with laws, expectations, and narrow boundaries slowly begins dissolving into softer shapes, torchlight reflected upon wet stone, monastery bells drifting through fog, smoke rising above frozen roofs, women carrying candles through darkened halls, footsteps fading along snowy roads. The night grows warmer. Dimmer? Still. You no longer hear the arguments of courts or markets, only the hush of wind around distant towers and the gentle creak of old wooden beams settling in the cold. Beyond the shutters, snow continues falling over fields, chapels, cottages, abbeys, and sleeping towns alike, covering roads, covering footprints, softening even the hardest edges of the world. And somewhere beneath those quiet roofs, countless unseen lives continue by firelight mending cloth, stirring broth, whispering prayers, comforting children, guarding tiny fragments of knowledge through another winter night. The bell sound once more in the distance, then fade, then disappear entirely into the dark, and slowly, gently, the medieval world drifts away with them, leaving only warmth, quiet, and the soft, steady comfort of rest at the end of a long road.